I was still flat on the recovery table, 1 hour out of an emergency cesarean section, my legs numb and my mind swimming in the last gray fog of the anesthesia, when the family I had married into pressed a pen into my limp hand and tried to make me sign away my entire life. My husband's mother guided my fingers toward the line herself, telling me softly that it was only the discharge paperwork, and when I tried to pull my hand back, the motion knocked against my fresh incision, and I cried out. My newborn daughter was screaming in the bassinet 2 feet away, and then what happened next was absolutely unbelievable. Before I get into the story, you all know how much I love seeing where you are watching from and what hour it is in your part of the world. But today I want to ask you something a little deeper. Have you ever been betrayed by the family you chose, the one you married into and trusted with your whole heart? Or do you still believe that a wedding ring makes a person loyal? Drop your location, your local time, and a simple yes or no in the comments right now. I read all of them. My name is Grace, and for most of my life, I was the woman who believed that if she was good enough at her work, the people around her would finally treat her as an equal. I grew up in the old money quiet of Back Bay in Boston, Massachusetts, in a family where the furniture was worth more than most people's homes and where warmth was rationed like an expensive medicine. My parents loved their reputation far more than they loved each other, and I learned very young that I would never be praised simply for existing. I would have to build something. So I did. I refused the easy path my last name offered me, and I became an architect and a developer, the kind who actually walks the muddy ground of a site at 6 in the morning and reads a zoning code like other people read a novel. I was good at it. I was better than good, and I spent years believing that being excellent would be enough to make me safe. Then I met Julian Whitlock, and for a while I thought I had finally found a family that wanted me for me. The Whitlocks ran one of the largest real estate development firms in New England, a publicly traded company with a tower full of glass offices and a name carved over the door. Julian was charming and easy, and he told me that his family valued talent above everything, that with me beside him, the firm could become something legendary. His mother, Beatrice, kissed both my cheeks and called me the daughter she had always wanted. His father, Gerald, the chairman, shook my hand and welcomed me onto the team. I was 31 years old, in love, and so hungry to belong that I did not stop to ask why a family that valued talent so highly had never once produced any of their own. I should have asked, because within 2 years of our wedding, I understood the truth. The Whitlocks did not value talent. They harvested it. Gerald had not closed a real deal in a decade. Julian was a presentation, a handsome face for the brochures, a man who could charm a room and sign his name, but who could not read a structural drawing if his life depended on it. The firm survived on borrowed glamour and a falling reputation, and what they needed desperately was someone who could actually build. They needed me, and I, fool that I was, gave them everything I had. To understand what turned them into monsters, you have to understand the Old Harbor Project. It was the largest urban redevelopment Boston had seen in a generation, a $400 million plan to transform 40 acres of dead waterfront into housing and parks and offices, the kind of project that defines a career in a company for 50 years, and I built it from nothing. I spent 3 years on it. I designed the master plan with my own hands. I sat across the table from city planners and harbor commissioners and skeptical investors, and I won them over one by one through hundreds of meetings until the approvals fell into place. The memoranda of understanding with the city were negotiated by me and registered under my professional license. The architectural master plans were my copyrighted work. Every brick of that future development existed because of me. The Whitlock name was on the press releases, but the project itself was mine in every way that the law recognizes. And here is the part that would later save my life. Years of dealing with this family had taught me one hard lesson, which is that the Whitlocks rewrite history the moment your back is turned. I had watched it happen with smaller deals. I would spend 6 months securing a permit, and at the ribbon cutting, Gerald would stand in front of the cameras and describe how the firm had achieved it, as if I had simply been carrying his coffee. The first time, I told myself I was being petty. The second time, I started keeping records. By the third time, I had built a system. Every important meeting I attended had my own personal attorney, a sharp and tireless woman named Diane Okafor, either present in the room or listening on a line. And every significant conversation about that project, every promise, every negotiation, I recorded with full legal notice, and Diane kept copies in a vault that the Whitlocks could not touch. My husband's family thought my habit was paranoid and a little insulting. They had no idea that I was quietly building the cage they would one day lock themselves inside. The trouble truly began when I became pregnant. At first, Beatrice performed delight, planning showers and buying tiny shoes. But I started to notice a change in the way Gerald and Julian looked at me, a cold calculation behind their smiles, and I began to overhear conversations that stopped the moment I entered a room. The Old Harbor signing, the final ceremony where the firm would formally close the deal with the city and a syndicate of investors, was scheduled for the spring. And somewhere in those months, the Whitlocks did their arithmetic. They realized that I, the wife they had always treated as a clever ornament, was the single point of failure in their entire empire. My name was on the approvals, my license held the registrations, my copyright covered the plans. If I were ever to walk away and take my rights with me, the $400 million deal would collapse into dust, and the firm with it. So they made a plan to remove me, not to thank me, not to make me a partner, to erase me cleanly and quietly before the signing, and to do it while I was at my weakest. They would push a divorce I had never asked for, dressed up as something else, and they would harvest my rights along with my marriage, and they would do it while I was barely conscious and could not fight back. They simply waited for my body to give them their opening, and my daughter's difficult birth handed it to them. My labor went wrong fast. My blood pressure dropped, my daughter's heartbeat faltered, and the doctors at Boston General rushed me into an emergency cesarean section. When I surfaced from the deep pull of the anesthesia, shivering, my mouth dry as paper, the pain across my lower belly was a long line of fire. But the nurse laid my daughter, all 7 pounds and 4 ounces of her, against my chest, and the pain shrank to nothing. We named her Iris. For a few hours in that recovery room, I was happier than I had ever been in my life. Julian had gone home to rest, or so I thought. Just past 11 in the morning, while I lay alone with Iris in the bassinet beside me, the door opened. It was not a nurse. It was my husband's mother, Beatrice, in a cream-colored suit, followed by a man I recognized as one of the firm's lawyers, and behind them, quiet and pale, Julian himself. They were carrying a slim folder. Beatrice came to my side and stroked my hair and told me, in a voice like warm honey, that she hated to bother me, but the hospital and the insurance company needed some forms handled before I could be discharged, and that the firm's lawyer had kindly come to make it simple. I could barely lift my head. The room tilted when I moved. Beatrice opened the folder, slid the top page toward me on a clipboard, and held out a pen. I tried to read it. The words swam. But I am an architect, and even half-drugged my eye snags on things that do not belong, and what snagged me was a single phrase near the top of the page. It did not say discharge. It said dissolution of marriage and assignment of rights. I forced my eyes down the page, and I saw it all in pieces. A divorce settlement in which I waived every marital claim. A separate assignment transferring all of my professional rights. Every approval, every registration, every copyrighted plan for the Old Harbor project, to Whitlock Group for the sum of $1. No, I said. My voice was a dry whisper, but I said it. I am not signing this. Beatrice's warm mask did not slip. She told me gently that grief and surgery had me confused, that this was simply protecting the family and the baby, that a good mother would not want to drag her child through ugliness. The lawyer murmured that everything was perfectly standard, and Julian, my husband, the father of the child sleeping 3 feet away, would not meet my eyes. He stood by the wall and said quietly that it would be easier for everyone, Grace, if I just signed. That was the moment something in me went still. But I was too weak to argue, so I simply let my hand fall away from the clipboard. And that is when Beatrice stopped being gentle. She took my hand in both of hers, pressed the pen between my fingers, and began to guide it toward the signature line herself, telling me in a low, firm voice to stop being childish, that it was already decided. I tried to pull away. My arm jerked, the motion pulled at the surgical staples in my abdomen, and a bolt of pain so sharp it whitened my vision tore through me. I cried out, loudly, and my elbow caught the line of my intravenous drip and dragged it half out of my arm. What none of them knew was that my phone was lying face down on the tray table beside my pillow, and that out of 3 years of habit, the recorder was running. It had been running since before they walked in. And what they had not counted on at all was the nurse. My cry brought her through the door at a run. Her name was Rosa, and she took one look at the scene, at me bleeding from my arm with my face contorted, and 3 well-dressed strangers crowded over a post-surgical patient holding a pen, and she did not hesitate. She ordered them out. Beatrice tried to explain about paperwork, and Rosa cut her off and said that no patient 1 hour out of surgery was signing legal documents in her recovery room, and that if they did not leave, she would call security. Rosa had seen the whole thing, and Rosa would remember it. The Whitlocks gathered their folder, and Beatrice paused at the door and looked back at me, and for just 1 second the honey was gone from her voice, and she said very softly that I would regret making this hard. Then they were gone. That night, alone, with Iris asleep on my chest and the recorder safely backed up to Diane's vault 3 times over, I did not cry. I had cried enough in that family for a lifetime. Instead, I felt the strangest thing settle over me. A cold and total clarity, the same clarity I feel when I finally see the one flaw in a building that will bring the whole structure down. The woman who had spent years trying to earn the Whitlocks' love was simply gone. In her place was the architect who had built their empire and who knew exactly which pillar to pull. I called Diane at dawn. I told her everything, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said the words that turned my grief into a weapon. She said, "Grace, they did not just commit a cruelty, they handed you proof." For the next 3 weeks, while I recovered quietly at home and learned the soft new rhythm of my daughter, I let the Whitlocks believe they had won. I did not return Beatrice's calls. I did not confront Julian, who slept in a separate room now and barely spoke to me. I let them think I was a frightened, broken new mother who would eventually fold, and underneath that silence, Diane and I built the thing that would end them. We started with the truth of what I owned. Diane and I assembled the full record of the Old Harbor project, and it was even cleaner than I remembered. The memoranda with the city named me personally. The professional approvals ran through my license and could not legally transfer without my active witness consent. The master plans were registered as my copyrighted work. Without me freely and knowingly signing, Whitlock Group did not have the right to break ground on a single square foot of that waterfront. The entire $400 million deal rested on my name and my name alone. They had spent years convincing the world that the project was theirs, and in doing so, they had made themselves utterly dependent on a woman they were now trying to throw away. Then we secured the recording. Diane had it analyzed and authenticated, every voice identified, the timestamps verified against the hospital records that showed I had come out of surgery barely an hour before. We took a sworn statement from Rosa, the nurse, who remembered every detail and was more than willing to tell the truth. We gathered my medical records, showing the fresh incision, the dislodged drip, the documented distress. Piece by piece, we built a record so complete that there would be nothing left for the Whitlocks' expensive lawyers to argue about. I will be honest about how hard those weeks were. There were nights when I sat on the nursery floor at 3 a.m. with Iris on my shoulder and a knot of pure fear in my chest, certain that no amount of evidence could outmatch a family with a tower full of lawyers and a name that had ruled this city for 50 years. Diane talked me down more than once. She reminded me that the law does not care how old your money is, that a forged consent is a forged consent, and a coerced signature is a coerced signature, and that for the first time in my marriage, I held every card and the Whitlocks held none. Slowly, the fear hardened into resolve. I stopped flinching when Beatrice's name appeared on my phone. I began to sleep, and I began very quietly to plan the one move that would make all of this matter, which was the question of where and how the truth would finally come out. And then I learned the date of the Old Harbor signing ceremony. It was to be a grand public event held in the firm's own glass atrium, with the mayor's office in attendance, the lead investors, and a wall of financial press. Gerald would stand at a podium and sign the deal that would define the company for the next 50 years. Beatrice would glow in the front row. Julian would smile for the cameras. They had invited me, of course, as the supportive wife, never imagining I would actually come. They were so certain they had broken me that they did not bother to wonder why I sent back a warm and quiet note saying I would be honored to attend, and that I looked forward to celebrating the family's great achievement. The morning of the signing, the atrium was packed. Hundreds of people in their best clothes, cameras everywhere, a long table at the front draped in white with the contract waiting on it. Beatrice wore pale blue and a smile sharp enough to cut glass. Julian stood near his father, handsome and hollow. When I walked in, slow and careful, with Diane at my side and a slim leather folder in my hands, Gerald leaned toward me and murmured that he was glad I had come to my senses and that we would all put the unpleasantness behind us once the deal was done. "Of course, Gerald," I said softly, after the signing. Gerald rose and stepped to the podium. He thanked the city, the investors, the press. He spoke about the Whitlock vision, about a legacy of building, about the future of the harbor, and he did not say my name even once. And when he lifted his pen to sign the $400 million contract, I stood up from my seat in the second row, and in a clear, steady voice that carried across the whole silent atrium, I said that before anyone signed anything, the people in this room deserved to know who truly owned the Old Harbor project and how this family had tried to take it. I pressed a button, and my own voice filled the atrium from the speakers Diane had quietly arranged. My voice from that recovery room saying, "I am not signing this," and then Beatrice's honeyed command to stop being childish, and then the sound of my cry of pain. The entire room heard it. The investors heard it. The mayor's deputy heard it. The cameras caught every face. And then I opened my folder and held up the documents and explained, in the plain and certain voice of the woman who had actually built the thing they were about to sign, that the approvals belonged to me, that the registrations ran through my license, that the master plans were my copyrighted work, and that no part of this deal could proceed without my consent, which I was, as of this moment, formally and publicly withdrawing. The atrium erupted. Gerald went gray and gripped the podium. Beatrice shot to her feet, shouting that I was hysterical, that I was unwell, that I had clearly suffered some kind of breakdown after the birth, but the recording had already told the room the truth in her own voice, and no amount of shouting could unsay it. Julian simply sat down, slowly, like a man whose legs had stopped working, staring at the floor while 100 cameras turned toward him. The lead investor stood up at his table and asked Gerald, loudly enough for every microphone to catch it, whether it was true that the firm did not actually control the rights to its own flagship project. Gerald could not answer. He opened his mouth and closed it again. He had no answer. The deputy from the mayor's office gathered her papers and walked out before the noise had even died down. The deal that was meant to crown the Whitlock name died on that white draped table in front of the entire city, and every person in that room understood exactly why. The fallout was swift and complete. By the closing bell, Whitlock Group's stock had collapsed, and over the following days it kept falling as the investors fled, and the truth spread that the firm's signature asset had never belonged to it at all. The Old Harbor project, with its rights and approvals still safely in my hands, walked out the door with me. The recovery room recording and Rosa's statement became the center of an ugly legal and public reckoning that the Whitlocks could not spin away, because you cannot charm your way out of your own voice. Gerald lost his chairmanship as the board scrambled to save what little remained. The lenders who had propped up the firm for years called in their loans all at once, and the glass tower with the name carved over the door went up for sale within the year. Beatrice, who had spent her whole life performing grace in front of the right people, found that the right people no longer returned her calls. The invitations stopped. The charity boards that had once begged for her name quietly removed it. She had built her entire self out of other people's admiration, and when that admiration turned to contempt, there was simply nothing underneath. And Julian, my husband, who stood against a wall and told me it would be easier if I just signed, did not get the quiet divorce his family had planned for me. He got the divorce I chose on my terms, with the recording and the medical records and the nurse's account laid out plainly, and he walked away with exactly the share of my work that he had earned, which was nothing at all. I kept the project, I kept my license, my plans, my name, and I kept the only thing in that entire family that had ever truly been mine, which was my daughter. As for me, I am standing now in the bright office of my own development firm, the one I built fresh from the ground up, with the old harbor plans pinned to the wall, and my daughter Iris napping in a small crib in the corner where I can see her while I work. The project is moving forward at last, under my name, the way it always should have. I do not develop it for revenge. I develop it because it is good, and because I am good at it, and because for the first time in my life, no one is standing behind me waiting to write their name over my work. Looking back at that recovery room, at the pen pressed into my numb hand, and my husband watching from the wall, I understand something now that I did not understand at 31 years old. A ring does not make someone family. A shared name does not make someone loyal. Family is the people who run into the room when you cry out, like a nurse named Rosa, not the people who crowd over you with a folder. The Whitlocks spent years convincing the world that my work was theirs, and they forgot the one thing every architect knows, which is that whoever holds the foundation holds the entire building. They tried to erase me at the weakest moment of my life, and they handed me, in their own recorded voices, the proof that brought their tower down. Now my daughter is safe. The people who tried to harvest my life have nothing left to harvest, and the truth, which never needed to shout, simply played itself back. But I want to hear from you. Do you think I was right to expose them in front of the whole city, or do you think I went too far? Tell me your honest thoughts in the comments below. And if my story gave you a little strength today, please subscribe and ring the bell to join our community, where we share stories of justice every single day.